He had tended those roses for 31 years, and on the evening he vanished, not a single petal was out of place. But Miss Marple had noticed something small and green and lying just where it ought not to have been. Welcome to Mystery Stories, where every shadow hides a secret and every cup of tea may be your last. Settle in, pour yourself something warm, and let the story begin. Chapter 1. The Village That Kept Its Own Counsel. The village of Wychwood Parva had a particular talent for minding its own business, which is to say it minded everyone else's with extraordinary thoroughness and simply chose never to speak of it openly. It sat in a fold of the Cotswold hills like something forgotten in a drawer, not unpleasant, not remarkable, but entirely itself. There was the church, which was Norman at its oldest and Victorian at its newest, and entirely satisfactory throughout. There was the public house, the Lamb and Lantern, which smelled of wood smoke and old beer and the particular muddy contentment of working dogs. There was the post office, which doubled as a haberdashery and tripled, in the opinion of most residents, as the village's primary intelligence-gathering institution. And there were the lanes, those narrow, damp, eternally green lanes that wound between dry stone walls and arrived, eventually and without particular urgency, wherever one needed to be. Miss Jane Marple had come to Wychwood Parva in the second week of September at the invitation of her old friend Dorothy Calthwaite, who had recently become Mrs. Dorothy Fenwick upon marrying the village's retired schoolmaster, and who had written to say that the garden was still lovely in early autumn and there was a very comfortable spare room, and really, it would be doing Dorothy such a favor, because Gerald's sister Vivienne was coming for a fortnight, and Dorothy needed someone sensible to balance the conversation. Miss Marple had packed her knitting, her cardigan, her blue wool scarf with the rather unfortunate fringe she had been meaning to repair for 3 years, and her cheerful willingness to be wherever she was needed. She arrived by bus on a Tuesday afternoon when the light was the color of warm honey, and the hedgerows were beginning their slow surrender to red and amber. "You haven't changed at all," Dorothy said, which was the sort of thing one says and means warmly, even though it is never quite true. "I have changed considerably," Miss Marple replied, "but I don't suppose it shows in the ways that matter." Dorothy Fenwick was a comfortable woman of 67 with kind gray eyes and the habit of straightening things, cushions, flower arrangements, the conversation that comes from years of making a house into a home. Her husband Gerald was a tall man, slightly stooped from decades of classroom attention, with a measured voice and the permanent air of someone about to ask whether you had quite understood what he'd said. Their cottage was called Wisteria End, which was accurate in spring and merely charming at all other times. It stood at the eastern edge of the village proper, where the lane became a track, and the track became a field path, and the field path became the kind of decision that required proper footwear. "The garden is beautiful," Miss Marple said, and she meant it. It was. Even in early September, when many Cotswold gardens were beginning to look slightly disheveled, as though they had been out too long and couldn't quite find their hat, this one held itself with quiet authority. The roses along the south wall were still putting forth their last flowers, deep crimson, almost bruised, the color of old velvet. The dahlias had come into their own. The lawns were close-cut and very green against the stone. "That's all, Mr. Hobbs," Dorothy said, with a particular fond exasperation of someone who has come to rely on a thing and resents it slightly. "Edwin Hobbs. He's been our gardener for— Oh, Gerald, how long has Edwin been with us?" Gerald had appeared at the garden door with a cup of tea he had apparently forgotten he was carrying. 31 years, he said. "Since the spring we moved in." 31 years, Dorothy repeated, as though the number had a satisfying weight to it. "He knows this garden better than we do. Every bulb, every corner. He talks to the roses, you know, not poetically, literally, as if they had done something requiring comment." Miss Marple looked at the roses again. They were very fine. The kind of roses that spoke of sustained, attentive care over a long period, not spectacular care, not the fussing of an amateur, but the quiet, daily tending of someone who understood that a garden does not want to be improved so much as it wants to be understood. "He sounds rather wonderful," she said. "He is rather odd," Gerald said, with the precision of a man who considered these things categorically distinct. "But yes, the garden speaks for itself." The tea was brought out to the terrace, proper tea in a proper pot, with milk in a jug and biscuits on a plate. And they sat in the afternoon light and talked of nothing in particular for a pleasant hour. Miss Marple watched a robin investigate the base of the rose border, and found herself thinking about nothing more complicated than the pleasure of sitting still in a garden that had been looked after. She did not yet know about the disappearance. That would come in the morning. As most things do, in well-ordered villages, with the light and the news and the particular quality of silence that means something has changed. Chapter 2. An absence noticed at 7:30. Edwin Hobbs arrived every weekday morning at 7:30 precisely, and on Saturdays at 8, and never on Sundays because, as he had once explained to Gerald with absolute finality, God rested, and so did he. Dorothy knew this schedule the way she knew the chiming of the church clock, not by thought, but by the body's own quiet recognition. So when Wednesday morning came and brought with it the smell of autumn damp and the sound of wood pigeons, and the absence of the particular creak of the garden gate that Edwin always made, because he always lifted it slightly when he opened it, on account of its sticking, she noticed. She did not say anything at breakfast, not immediately. One did not wish to make a fuss. "Edwin's not come," she mentioned eventually, as she poured Miss Marple's second cup and Gerald rustled the newspaper with the practiced nonchalance of a man trying not to engage. "Perhaps he's unwell," Miss Marple said. "He is never unwell." Dorothy settled the teapot with the slight extra emphasis of a woman who has considered this point thoroughly. In 31 years, Edwin Hobbs has been absent twice, once for his mother's funeral, which was in 1998, and once for some business with his knee in 2011. Both times he left word the evening before. Miss Marple considered this. "And last evening?" she asked. "Nothing." Gerald lowered his newspaper by an inch. "He'll have something on. A medical appointment, perhaps," he would have said. Dorothy repeated. Miss Marple added a small amount of milk to her tea and turned to look at the garden through the window. The roses stood in the morning light quite motionless. The dahlia beds were neat. The lawn showed the parallel lines of yesterday's last mowing, still perfectly visible in the dew. Everything was exactly as it should be, which was, she found herself thinking, somehow the strangest thing. The garden of a man who was merely unwell might look a little anxious, somehow, neglected by anticipation, even before the absence had properly begun. But this garden looked finished, not abandoned, completed. As if Edwin Hobbs had known, yesterday evening, that he would not be back. She said nothing of this. It was far too early for that sort of thought, and probably she was simply reading things into a garden because it was a pleasant morning and one's mind wanted exercise. After breakfast, Dorothy telephoned Edwin's cottage. There was no answer. After that, Dorothy telephoned his sister Vera, who lived in the village of Barton Magna, some 4 miles away. Vera, according to Dorothy's report when she returned from the hallway, had not heard from Edwin since Sunday, which was unusual. They spoke every Tuesday evening without fail. This past Tuesday, there had been no call. "That's 2 days," Gerald said, and put down his newspaper entirely. They looked at one another, the three of them, with the particular expression of people who are not yet worried, but have privately decided that worrying would be entirely appropriate. "Perhaps we should walk round to the cottage," Miss Marple suggested mildly. Edwin Hobbs lived in a terrace of 3 cottages on the north side of the village, in what was called, with the optimistic geography of small settlements, Meadow Row, although the meadow in question had been built over in 1962 and was now a car park for the village hall. The cottages were old, stone-faced, with low windows and the kind of front gardens that suggested their owners had strong opinions about annuals. Edwin's garden, naturally, was exemplary. The cottage itself was shut, curtains drawn across both downstairs windows. A milk bottle on the step, Wednesday's delivery, uncollected, beginning to have that slightly reproachful look that untaken milk develops in the morning air. Dorothy knocked. Then again. Then Gerald tried, with the knocking style of a former schoolmaster, which carries in it an authority that refuses to be ignored. Nothing. Miss Marple stood slightly to one side and looked at the front garden while the others tried the door and called through the letterbox. The garden was impeccable. Borders edged. Gravel freshly raked. A pair of secateurs lying on the stone birdbath, blades carefully closed, angled just so. She looked at the secateurs for a long moment. They were lying precisely as someone would lay them down who was stepping away to attend to something else and intended to return, not abandoned, set down purposefully. But the milk said otherwise. "We should fetch Sergeant Tilly," Gerald said. "Yes," said Miss Marple, still looking at the secateurs. "I think we probably should." Chapter 3. What the postmistress already knew. Sergeant Alan Tilly was a comfortable man of 53 who had been the village's police presence for 11 years and had during that time dealt principally with speeding on the Barton Road, a dispute about a right-of-way that had simmered through 3 separate administrations, 2 bicycle thefts, and 1 memorable incident involving a disputed cockerel. He was not, by temperament or experience, a man accustomed to disappearances. He took notes carefully, in a small blue notebook. With a pen he had to click 3 times before it would work. He asked sensible questions. He said twice that Edwin had probably gone to visit someone and not thought to mention it, and once that sometimes people simply needed a change of scene. He said all of these things with the slightly strained confidence of a person speaking them partly for their own benefit. He agreed, in the end, to make inquiries, and to have a look inside the cottage if a key could be found. Dorothy produced a key Edwin had given her 1 year ago in case, and they all 4 went round again. And Sergeant Tilly let himself in with the careful professionalism of a man performing an unusual act entirely within procedure. The cottage was neat. This was the first and most striking thing. Whatever one might have expected, the chaos of a hurried departure, the disorder of something gone wrong, there was nothing of the sort. The kitchen was clean. The washing up had been done. On the kitchen table, a cup and saucer, both clean, a small plate with a biscuit tin beside it. The biscuit tin was open, and there were still biscuits in it. The sitting room held a chair positioned toward the window, a reading chair, by the look of it, angled to catch the afternoon light, with a library book on the side table beside it. The book was closed, a receipt used as a bookmark at roughly the halfway point. "He was reading," Dorothy said softly. "Or had been," Miss Marple replied. She looked at the bookmark, a receipt from the village shop dated last Monday. Edwin had been about halfway through a book about the history of English kitchen gardens, which Miss Marple found both unsurprising and, in its small way, touching. He had been reading about the thing he loved best. Upstairs, his bed was made. Not the anxious making of someone preparing to be away, with all the surfaces cleared and the wardrobe doors properly closed, but the ordinary making of a man who made his bed every morning as a matter of course. His razor was on the bathroom shelf. His good coat hung in the wardrobe. His walking boots were under the stairs. Sergeant Tilly looked increasingly uncomfortable as each room was found neat and undisturbed. His passport, Gerald said thoughtfully, looking through a small pile of correspondence on the writing desk in the bedroom. Would he keep it here? I wouldn't know where Edwin would keep his passport, Dorothy said. Nobody had thought to ask whether Edwin even had a passport, which told you a great deal about Edwin Hobbs, or at least about what his acquaintances expected of him. Miss Marple descended the narrow staircase and went back to the kitchen, while the others continued to search without quite knowing what they were looking for. She stood for a moment by the window and looked at the back garden, which was, like the front, precise and tended and very quiet. Then she went to the back door. It was unlocked. She opened it quietly and stepped out. The air smelled of compost and the particular mineral freshness of damp stone. Asters were in bloom along the fence, small white ones, very common, and for that reason very cheerful. The path was stone-flagged, the flags slightly uneven, each one with its little border of dark green moss. She looked at the path carefully, and then at the gate at the bottom of the garden. The gate was unlatched. Not open, still in its frame, but not latched. The kind of thing that happens when someone goes through in a hurry, or when someone goes through and does not expect to return. She latched it herself, carefully, and went back inside. An hour later, as they were leaving, she stopped at the post office. Mrs. Audrey Pickles ran the post office with the combination of absolute administrative competence and apparently limitless personal curiosity that Miss Marple had come to recognize as the single most reliable source of village intelligence in any English settlement. Audrey Pickles was a small, bright-eyed woman of 60, with hair the color of pewter and the manner of someone who is genuinely interested in absolutely everything. She was, Miss Marple suspected, the kind of person who knows what she knows and waits to be asked. "I suppose you've heard about Edwin Hobbs," Miss Marple said pleasantly, purchasing a stamp she didn't immediately need. "I have not," Audrey said, with the slightly too prompt quality of someone who has been waiting. "What's happened?" "He seems to have gone away rather suddenly." Without mentioning it to anyone, Audrey's bright eyes considered this for a moment. "Well," she said. "Well," Miss Marple agreed. There was a small pause. "I did notice," Audrey said, aligning a pile of envelopes that did not need aligning, "that Edwin was in the shop on Monday afternoon. He bought his usual things, but he also bought a box of those shortbread biscuits he doesn't normally get. The nice ones in the tin. He said they were for a visitor." Miss Marple thought of the biscuit tin on the kitchen table. Open. Still full. "Did he say who was visiting?" "No." Audrey paused. "But he seemed, I don't know how to say it exactly. He seemed pleased. And a little nervous. Which is unusual for Edwin, because Edwin is not normally nervous about anything." Miss Marple thanked her and went out into the September morning with a great deal to think about, and a stamp she had no immediate use for. She used it that evening to write to her nephew Raymond, which was something she had been meaning to do for several weeks. It felt satisfying to have a reason. Chapter 4. Gerald's Sister and the Question of the Past. Vivienne Fenwick arrived on Thursday morning in a taxi from the station, which in itself announced something about her. People who knew Wychwood Parva came by bus, or were collected by someone, or walked from Barton Magna on the footpath if they were constitutionally cheerful. People who arrived in taxis from the station were either strangers or people who did not quite consider themselves to belong. Vivienne Fenwick was Gerald's younger sister by 7 years, and resembled him in the way that a completed sentence resembles its most important word. You could see the family structure, but the emphasis had fallen differently. She was 61, slim and straight, with gray-brown hair cut practically short and eyes that took in a room in one quick survey, the way a person does when they have learned to assess situations from experience. She was, Miss Marple gathered over the course of the first morning, a retired civil servant of some seniority, something to do with planning or land registration. One of those functions of government that is essential and largely invisible, who had lived alone in Cheltenham for 20 years and who had come to Wychwood Parva not entirely because she wanted to. She and Edwin knew each other, Dorothy mentioned to Miss Marple as they were walking to the church on Thursday afternoon, ostensibly to arrange some chrysanthemums Mrs. Blackwood had left, actually to exchange information in privacy. Years ago. Before Gerald and I married. She doesn't like to talk about it. In what sense knew each other? Miss Marple asked. I never entirely understood, Dorothy said, with the honest vagueness of a person who chose not to press. There was some thing between them. A friendship, Gerald called it. But Gerald calls everything a friendship that he doesn't want to categorize more precisely. Did Edwin know she was coming? Dorothy stopped walking for a moment, the chrysanthemums in her arms going still. Actually, I'm not sure. I mentioned it to him last week. I don't know that I said the exact dates. She looked troubled. Do you think? I don't think anything yet, Miss Marple said pleasantly. I'm only gathering. The church was cool and smelled of stone and old flowers and the centuries-long accumulation of quiet sitting and quiet prayer. Miss Marple found this calming. Churches in small English villages always seemed to her the most honest places. They had been built by people who believed, and they retained that quality, and they did not pretend. She arranged chrysanthemums beside the font while Dorothy took the ones near the altar, and they talked quietly about the Hobbs family, Edwin's history in the village, his personality, his habits, and Miss Marple listened and filed things away with the patient thoroughness that was perhaps her greatest talent. Edwin Hobbs had come to Wychwood Parva in the late 1980s, having grown up in Bristol, which he had left without explanation at the age of 28. He had arrived with good references from a garden designer in Bath and the kind of reputation that speaks softly and goes a long way. He had no family in the village, only the sister Vera and Barton Magna, and had always seemed content with his own company and the company of growing things. He was not, Dorothy thought, an unhappy man. He was private. There was a distinction. Was there any, in his manner, in the last few weeks, anything different? Miss Marple asked. Dorothy was quiet for a moment, her hands busy with the chrysanthemums. He was distracted, she said finally. Once or twice I spoke to him and had to repeat myself. Edwin never requires repetition. He always listens the first time. She paused. And he came in for his wages on Friday. He always comes on a Friday. And he seemed in a hurry to be off, which is not like him. He usually stays for a cup of tea. We've always had our cup of tea on Fridays. And last Friday, he said he had somewhere to be. Did he say where? No, Dorothy said quietly. And I didn't ask. I suppose I should have. Miss Marple patted her arm. One never does, she said. That is the perpetual difficulty. When they returned to Wisteria End, they found Vivian Fenwick in the sitting room with a cup of tea going cold beside her and a peculiar expression on her face, not distress exactly, but the controlled stillness of a person managing an emotion they had not expected to feel. She had been told about Edwin. I see, she said, when Dorothy had finished explaining the situation. Then nothing else for quite a long while. Miss Marple sat down quietly and picked up her knitting and said nothing at all. Sometimes saying nothing is the most informative thing you can do. Chapter 5. The Matter of the Visitor. By Thursday evening, Sergeant Tilley had confirmed that Edwin Hobbs had not taken the bus from Barton Magna on Tuesday or Wednesday, had not been seen at the railway station, had not, as far as could be established, been seen anywhere at all after Tuesday morning, when he had been observed by a Mrs. Greta Petals, who walked her spaniel along Meadow Row each morning, standing at his front gate and looking up the lane in what she described as a considering sort of way. Considering? Miss Marple asked when Dorothy relayed this. Her word, Dorothy said, as if he was making up his mind about something. Miss Marple filed this under useful. She had also, through the quiet industry of continued conversation with various residents, assembled a partial account of Edwin's Tuesday. He had been to the village shop in the morning, not the afternoon as on Monday, but the morning, which was unusual, as Edwin normally came to the shop on Mondays and Thursdays. He had purchased, among ordinary things, a jar of good mustard, the kind sold in the delicatessen section rather than the basic shelves, and a small bottle of decent sherry. Edwin Hobbs, Dorothy had confirmed, did not drink sherry. He was expecting someone, Miss Marple said to herself, in her room before bed, while she wound her wool and thought things through. He was expecting someone, and he was pleased and nervous about it, and he was making arrangements. And then either the visitor came or the visitor didn't come, and either way, Edwin left. Without his good coat, without his walking boots, without his razor. She put down her wool. Or, he left, she said quietly to the lamp before the visitor arrived. In the morning, she went to see Vera Hobbs. Vera Hobbs was 58, shorter than her brother, with the broad, capable hands of someone who did their own garden and their own repairs and expected nothing from anyone that they weren't prepared to supply themselves. She had driven over from Barton Magna the day before and had been to see Sergeant Tilley and had been, from Dorothy's account, very composed and very worried in the particular combination that siblings of self-contained people often manage. She received Miss Marple in her brother's kitchen. She had taken the spare key back from Dorothy, with thanks, and was clearly there to conduct her own investigation, with the slightly measuring look of a woman who had been hearing about Miss Marple since Wednesday. "Dorothy says, you're sharp," she said. "Dorothy is kind," Miss Marple replied. They sat at the kitchen table, with the same biscuit tin still open between them, and Miss Marple asked gentle, specific questions, and Vera answered them with the same directness she presumably brought to everything. Edwin had telephoned her on Sunday as usual. He had been in normal spirits, perhaps slightly preoccupied, but not distressed. He had mentioned, in passing, that he was expecting a letter that had not yet arrived. "What letter?" Miss Marple asked. He didn't say. He only mentioned it because he had apparently been to the post office twice that week. He wasn't a man who waited for things. If he said he was waiting, there was a reason. Miss Marple thought of Audrey Petals and her bright, attentive eyes. Did he say anything else? Anything about visitors, or meetings, or plans? Vera was quiet for a moment. She looked at the biscuit tin. She said slowly that he thought things might be about to get sorted. That was the phrase he used. Sorted. I asked him what things, and he laughed, which was unusual. Edwin doesn't laugh carelessly, and said never mind, and changed the subject. Things getting sorted. Miss Marple sat with that phrase while she walked back to Wisteria End through the village lane, past the pub and the post office and the little stone church and the war memorial with its familiar names and its single small vase of fresh flowers, renewed each week by someone who never said it. Was them. Things getting sorted implied things that had previously been unsorted. It implied a history of some kind, an unresolved matter, a thread that had been hanging loose, and which someone, Edwin, or the expected visitor, or both, had finally decided to take up and tie off. Whether that had gone well or badly, she could not yet say. She stopped at the post office. The letter Edwin Hobbs was expecting, she said to Audrey Petals. "Would you have any reason to know anything about it?" Audrey Petals did not pretend to misunderstand the question. "He did ask me," she said carefully, "whether anything had come. On the Monday, and the previous Thursday as well. I told him both times there was nothing. But," she paused. "On Tuesday morning, I wasn't here Tuesday morning. It was my daughter's appointment. Lynette covers for me. But Lynette said a man came in and asked for Edwin. Not a local, she said. Asked whether Edwin Hobbs was at home and where his cottage was." Miss Marple was very still. "What sort of man?" Lynette said, older. "Well-dressed, in a quiet way. Spoke nicely. She said he had a slight accent. She wasn't sure what kind. Possibly Welsh, she thought. And she told him where the cottage was?" "She did. It's a small village, not a secret." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "Of course not." She thanked Audrey and walked on, and the September leaves moved in the hedge, and somewhere a wood pigeon began its comfortable repetitive statement. And she thought, a well-dressed older man, possibly Welsh, who came asking after Edwin on Tuesday morning, and who had presumably found him. Whether Edwin had then gone somewhere with this man, or whether the man had gone away and Edwin had gone somewhere alone, or whether something else entirely had occurred, she did not yet know. But the picture was developing, the way photographs develop, slowly and in a certain kind of light. Chapter 6. 31 years and a kept secret. Miss Marple had a theory, not yet formed enough to be called a theory, really, more a sense of shape, like seeing the outline of furniture in a dark room before the lamp is lit, that the key to Edwin Hobbs' disappearance was not in Wychwood Parva at all, but in Bristol, where he had grown up, and from which he had departed at the age of 28 without explanation. She mentioned this to no one. It was too early for that. What she did instead was sit with Vivienne Fenwick on Friday morning. While Dorothy was at her weekly appointment with the chiropodist, and Gerald was in his study working on a history of local education that he had been working on for some years, and that Miss Marple suspected brought him equal parts joy and industry, and she listened. Vivienne did not speak easily. She spoke the way some people knit, steadily with attention, with long pauses that were not really pauses, but the silence between careful stitches. Miss Marple, who understood knitting extremely well, simply waited. Edwin and I knew each other, Vivienne said eventually, when we were young, before Gerald and Dorothy. Before any of this, really. In Bristol? Vivienne looked at her. A very clear look. Dorothy told you about Bristol? Only that he came from there. The rest I put together. Vivienne considered this. She seemed not resigned quite, but prepared. She set down her cup and looked at the garden for a moment, at the roses still holding on along the south wall, and when she spoke again, it was in the measured tone of someone who has decided to be honest, because they have decided it is time. We were both young and we were both foolish, she said, and that seems insufficient to describe 35 years of keeping something to oneself, but there it is. She had met Edwin Hobbs in Bristol in the spring of 1981. She was 23, working in a government office. He was 24, working for a landscape architect. They had been, briefly and intensely, in love, the kind that people are in their 20s when they are serious people who have not yet found what they want and mistake one another for it. There had been a complication. Not a dramatic one, not the kind of complication that makes a story. Only the ordinary, human kind. A misunderstanding that became an argument, that became a silence, that became too long to break easily. He had thought she meant to leave. She had thought he did not want her to stay. Both, in their pride and their mutual stubbornness, had said nothing and done nothing. And the summer had ended and they had not spoken again. And then Gerald brought me to Wychwood Parva 3 years later, Vivienne said. And there was Edwin, already established, already the village's own, and neither of us said anything. To each other, or to Gerald, or to Dorothy. A great deal of not saying things, Miss Marple observed gently. A great deal, Vivienne agreed. The English national pastime. She had moved to Cheltenham after that, and had visited Gerald and Dorothy infrequently, and had always known that Edwin would be here, in this village, in this garden, and had never quite decided what to do about it. 35 years of quarterly decisions to leave it alone. And then Edwin telephoned me, Vivienne said. About a month ago. Miss Marple was quite still. He telephoned me and said, and I am remembering this exactly, because I have thought about it very many times since. He said that he had heard from someone he hadn't expected to hear from, and that it seemed there were some things that wanted sorting, and that he thought I should perhaps know, before any of it happened. And I asked him what things, and he said, it's about Bristol. She stopped. He said it was about Bristol, she repeated, more quietly. And you came, Miss Marple said. I'm here, aren't I? A bird moved in the rose border, not the robin, a blackbird, larger, with its perfect quiet alertness. It found something in the soil and was briefly satisfied and flew away. Did he say anything else? Miss Marple asked. About what, specifically, from Bristol? There was a man, Vivienne said carefully. A man we both knew. He was involved in, there was a financial matter. Property. Money that changed hands in a way that wasn't entirely correct. Edwin knew about it and said nothing. He was young, and he was frightened, and he thought it wasn't his business. She paused. I think he has regretted it ever since. And this man, this person from Bristol, is he perhaps the person who came to find Edwin on Tuesday morning? Vivienne looked at her with the full directness she had been withholding until now. His name is David Carow, she said. He is 73. He has been in Cardiff for 20 years, which would account for the Welsh. And if he has come here, then Edwin's disappearance is not. It is not Edwin simply going somewhere. She said this very quietly, with a controlled steadiness that was more frightening than alarm would have been. It might be Edwin going somewhere, Miss Marple said, with equal quietness, but not of his own choice. Vivienne did not reply. She picked up her cup. The tea was cold. She drank it anyway. Chapter 7. The garden tells its own story. Miss Marple did not, as some might have expected her to, rush to Sergeant Tilly with this information. She thought at first. One should always think first. What she knew, Edwin Hobbs had, 35 years ago, witnessed something financially improper. He had stayed silent. He had then, 1 month ago, been contacted by someone connected to this matter, almost certainly David Carow, and had been waiting for a letter and expecting a visitor. He had disappeared on Tuesday, the same day a well-dressed older man had asked for his address. He had left without his coat, his boots, his razor, and with his back gate unlatched. What she did not know, whether Edwin had gone willingly or otherwise, whether he was frightened or resigned or determined, whether he was safe. She put these things in order in her mind, and then she went into the garden. She had a particular fondness for gardens in the early autumn, when the season had made its decision and was executing it with dignity. There was an honesty to September gardens that July ones sometimes lacked, less performance, more reality. Things were what they were. The ones that had been tended well were apparent. The ones that had been struggled through were also apparent, in their own way. Edwin's garden spoke very clearly of someone who had been tending it until recently, and very specifically until Tuesday. She walked the garden path carefully, the stone flags damp and slightly mossy underfoot, the asters nodding in the slight breeze. She examined the beds without touching. The tools in the small shed were hung on their proper hooks, each wiped clean. The kind of end-of-day tidying that speaks of habit, not emergency. The compost heap had been turned recently. The greenhouse showed no neglect. She stood in the greenhouse for a while, looking at a row of seedlings in small pots, autumn seedlings, for spring planting, labeled in Edwin's small, neat handwriting. Sweet peas. Foxgloves. A delphinium variety she did not recognize. He had been planning for spring. This, more than anything, settled something in Miss Marple's mind. A man who has surrendered to despair or who has made a permanent decision to go elsewhere does not sow spring seeds in early September. Those seedlings were an act of faith. He had planted them expecting to see them through. He had not gone willingly. She went back to the shed and looked at the tools again. Something bothered her. She stood with it for a moment, the shed warm with the smell of creosote and old wood and the particular dusty earthiness of long-used gardening equipment, and tried to identify what was wrong. The trowel. It was in the wrong place. Not conspicuously wrong, not dropped, not flung, not hurled across the shed, but in the wrong place. It was hanging on the hook designated, according to the label beneath, for the hand fork, and the hand fork was on the trowel hook. They had been swapped. Edwin Hobbs, who had tended this garden for 31 years, who made his tools every evening before he left, who had a label for each hook, would never swap his trowel and his hand fork, unless someone else had replaced them. Someone who had been in the shed. Someone who had not known the system well enough to know the difference. She replaced them correctly, trowel to trowel, hand fork to fork, and did it slowly, and thought about what this meant. Not robbery. Nothing was missing that she could see. Not vandalism. The shed was otherwise perfectly ordered. Someone had been in the shed, had handled the tools, had replaced them in haste or without care, and had left. The same person who had left the back gate unlatched? She went back to the gate and examined it carefully. The latch was the simple iron drop bar kind. She looked at the ground just beyond it. The path continued as a gravel track along the back of the row, shared by all 3 cottages, and found the gravel slightly disturbed in an irregular way that could have meant anything and probably meant a scuffle. Or could mean a scuffle. She reminded herself that gravel is disturbed by many things, and that one must be careful about reading what one wants to find rather than what is there. But the seedlings. The seedlings were clear. She went back to Wisteria End with mud on her shoes and a quiet, settled certainty that wherever Edwin Hobbs had gone, it had not been his idea. She telephoned a friend that afternoon, a retired police inspector who had consulted her on several occasions and who lived in Cirencester, and who could be relied upon for both discretion and action. She explained what she knew concisely, and he listened without interrupting, which was one of his better qualities. "David Carow," he said when she had finished. "That name is familiar. Not from anything serious. Planning irregularities, property dealings that were sharp rather than strictly illegal. Cardiff area, you said? Recently. Bristol before that. I'll make some enquiries," he said. Quietly. "Thank you," Miss Marple said, "and quickly if possible. I have some concern about the spring seedlings." Chapter 8. The Lamb and Lantern has its own intelligence. The Lamb and Lantern was the kind of public house that exists in small English villages as a sort of parallel civic institution, not official, not elected, not recorded in any minute book, but functioning with remarkable efficiency as a place where information flows, positions are taken, and the business of community life is conducted in the cheerful semi-privacy of general conversation. Miss Marple did not normally frequent public houses in the evenings. She was not, she would have said, that kind of person. But she was the kind of person who occasionally did the unexpected thing when the unexpected thing was the practical one, and so on Friday evening she asked Dorothy whether she might accompany Gerald to the Lamb and Lantern for a glass of something, on the grounds that she found it was useful to get a feel for a place. Dorothy, who understood Miss Marple extremely well after 40 years of friendship, said that was an excellent idea, and that she herself had a slight headache and would have an early night. Gerald, who understood Dorothy extremely well after 8 years of marriage, asked no questions and took his hat. The pub was warm in the way old country pubs are warm, wood and stone and fire, and the accumulated heat of many hundreds of evenings of people being comfortable together. The barman was a man of 40 called Robert, who had the quick, patient intelligence of someone who listens for a living. He knew Gerald, naturally, and was introduced to Miss Marple with the pleasant neutrality of a man who forms his own opinions over time. Gerald was, it turned out, well liked in the village. This did not surprise Miss Marple. Former schoolmasters of the right kind often are, in the places where they have taught, and she sat quietly at the bar over her small sherry while people came and went and spoke about Edwin, because Edwin was the village's primary topic and had been since Wednesday. She listened with the pleasurable attention of someone who knits in a room of conversation, present, apparently occupied, entirely alert. There was, she gathered, a somewhat unusual degree of upset. Not the pleasant, excited upset of village gossip, which tends toward speculation and enjoys itself, but the genuinely troubled upset of people who liked a man and were worried about him. Several people mentioned the garden, always the garden, as though the garden stood for Edwin in a way he himself never quite occupied. A woman named Margaret Voss, who had had her garden done by Edwin some years ago and spoke of the experience with the reverence reserved for transformative events, said she hadn't slept properly since Wednesday and wasn't ashamed to say so. An older man, 70s, leather jacket. The particular self-contained manner of someone who has spent a great deal of time outdoors, sat at the far end of the bar and listened without contributing, which caught Miss Marple's attention precisely because everyone else contributed. She watched him peripherally. He drank a pint of bitter with patient attention. He looked at the fire more than he looked at the people. Once, someone addressed a remark to him, something about whether he'd known Edwin long, and he said yes, a good while, and turned back to the fire. After some time, he got up and went to the gents, and Miss Marple looked at his jacket on the bar stool. He had hung it there, and at the pocket from which the edge of a folded paper was just visible. She looked at it only long enough to see that it was a letter, still folded, on cream paper. She looked away. When he returned, she felt him glance at her, not alerted, not suspicious, just the reflexive check of a private person in a public space, making sure nothing has changed. She was placidly examining the mirror behind the bar, which she genuinely found attractive on its own merits. After another 15 minutes, he paid and left. "That man," Miss Marple said pleasantly to Robert the barman. "I wonder if I've seen him before somewhere. Has he been in much?" "Never before tonight," Robert said. "Said he was looking up an old friend. Edwin Hobbs, as it happens." He paused. "Which is unfortunate timing. Isn't it?" Miss Marple said, and asked for another half of her sherry and filed several things away simultaneously. Gerald, who had been engaged in conversation about the cricket club's autumn fundraiser, appeared beside her. "Ready to head back?" "In a moment," Miss Marple said. She was watching the door through which the man in the leather jacket had left, thinking about the letter in his pocket, thinking about Bristol, thinking about spring seedlings. "Gerald," she said, as they finally left, "do you know offhand whether Edwin had any connection to the old Blackwood land purchase? The one that fell through in the 90s? Gerald looked at her. "How on earth do you know about that?" "I don't," Miss Marple said. "That's why I'm asking." He was quiet for a moment. They walked in the cool September evening, the stars very clear above the Cotswold hills, the lane smelling of damp leaves and distant bonfire. "Edwin was involved," Gerald said carefully. "In a peripheral way. He worked for the man who surveyed the land. There was something, a question of what was known and what was disclosed. Nothing came of it officially, but it was talked about at the time. Who was the man he worked for?" Gerald thought. "A developer, I think, out of Bristol. I don't remember the name." Miss Marple did not supply it. "Not yet." "Thank you," she said. "I'm sorry to ask cryptic questions. It's a bad habit." "It seems to be a productive one," Gerald said, with something like admiration. Chapter 9. A letter arrives too late. On Saturday morning, a letter arrived at Edwin Hobbs's cottage. It arrived with the post, in the ordinary way, and was left by the postman in the letterbox in the front door, where it lay until Vera came round at 11 and found it when she let herself in. She brought it to Wisteria End unopened, which showed both her respect for her brother and her recognition that something larger than family correspondence was now at work. Sergeant Tilly, who had been roped into the investigation of Edwin's disappearance with increasing seriousness since Miss Marple's telephone call to Cirencester had resulted, through a chain of connections she declined to make explicit, in a gentle enquiry from a detective inspector in Cheltenham about a Mr. David Carow, arrived as well. They all sat in Dorothy's sitting room and looked at the letter. It was addressed in a neat hand, older, slightly formal, the kind of writing that suggests a generation who were taught penmanship as something that mattered. It had a Cardiff postmark. It was dated the previous Friday. Sergeant Tilly opened it, carefully, with everyone watching. It was a single page. Miss Marple, from her position 2 seats to the left, could not read it directly, but she watched Sergeant Tilly's face as he read it, which was informative in its own right. He read it once, quickly, then again, slowly. Then he put it down on the table. "It's from a solicitor," he said. "In Cardiff. Acting on behalf of the late estate of a man named Hugh Carow, David Carow's brother." He paused. "Hugh Carow died 3 months ago. Apparently, the solicitor says he kept a document, something Edwin had signed back in the 90s, witnessing a transaction that the solicitor describes as of questionable propriety. Hugh kept it all these years. His dying instruction was that it should be destroyed, and that Edwin Hobbs should be informed of its destruction." A silence settled over the room. "The letter is telling Edwin that the document no longer exists," Gerald said. "Yes," Sergeant Tilly said. "It's over," Vivian said, very quietly, from the armchair by the window. "Whatever it was, whatever he was worried about, it's over. Hugh destroyed it." "But Edwin didn't know that," Miss Marple said. "He was waiting for this letter. He hadn't received it. Because his brother David came first." She said it without accusation, as a simple arrangement of facts. They all turned to look at her. "David Carow came here to find Edwin before this letter arrived," she continued. "He came on Tuesday morning. The letter was posted Friday and arrived today, so Edwin hadn't received it by Tuesday. He didn't know his freedom was already arranged. He only knew that David had come to find him. What would David want? Sergeant Tilly asked. That's rather the question, Miss Marple said. Possibly the same as his brother, to put things to rest. Possibly something more complicated. The document that Hugh kept and intended to destroy was evidence of something Edwin had witnessed. That is, it was something Edwin could in theory be pressured with. If David came before the letter arrived, and before Edwin knew the document was destroyed, he could have pressured Edwin, Gerald said, with something that no longer exists. Or convinced Edwin that it still existed, Miss Marple said, and persuaded him to come along quietly, to avoid trouble. Edwin, not knowing the document was gone, might very well have agreed. To protect someone. To avoid a scandal. To, as he put it to his sister, get things sorted. Vera made a sound that was not quite a word and looked at her hands. The man at the pub last night, Miss Marple said. The one with the letter in his pocket. Older gentleman. Leather jacket. Slight accent. I believe that was David Carow. Sergeant Tilly looked at her. You saw him? I was having a sherry, Miss Marple said simply. There was a silence. He had a letter, she continued. Folded, cream paper. I didn't read it, of course, but I saw its edge. He was in the Lamb and Lantern asking about Edwin. He had been to Edwin's cottage. That much seems clear from the unlatched gate and the tools in the wrong place in the shed, and had either found Edwin there or found that Edwin had already gone, or taken him from the shed, Sergeant Tilly said. And suddenly his voice was less the comfortable voice of a village policeman and more something considerably more serious. Or taken him from the shed, Miss Marple agreed. Yes. She folded her hands in her lap. I think, she said quietly, that we need to find David Carow, and I think he will not be far, because he had a letter in his pocket last night, which means he had received a copy of what was sent to Edwin, the solicitor's letter, and he will have read it, and he will know that whatever leverage he thought he had is now gone. She paused. And that may mean that whatever he has done with Edwin, it may mean he needs to undo it. Unless, Sergeant Tilly said. Yes, Miss Marple said. Unless. Chapter 10. Where a man goes when he does not want to be found. It was Gerald, in the end, who thought of Linden House. He mentioned it carefully over the Saturday lunch that nobody was eating properly as something that might be relevant and might not be. Linden House was a property on the edge of the village. Not quite in the village, really. More in that indeterminate zone between settlement and countryside where the lane loses confidence. It had been empty for several years, having been a short-let rental that had fallen out of the rental register when its owner, a Mrs. Partridge of Swindon, had become too elderly to manage it. It was not abandoned. Someone came to maintain the exterior occasionally, but it was consistently unoccupied. Edwin did the garden there. Years ago, Gerald said, when it was still regularly rented. He would know it. He would know if it was empty. Would he know how to get in? Dorothy asked. He certainly would, said Vivienne, from her position by the window where she had stationed herself, apparently finding the view of the garden steadying. He mentioned it once. He said the back window of the garden room had a faulty latch that had never been properly fixed. He said it every time it came up in conversation. He found it professionally irritating. There was a brief, significant silence. A man who needs somewhere to go quietly, Miss Marple said, and who knows the village well enough to know where to go. She had been revising her understanding of the situation since the solicitor's letter. The picture was shifting. If David Carow had come with the intention of pressure or intimidation, and if Edwin, being Edwin, had decided to remove himself rather than comply or argue or be bullied, then the disappeared man was not necessarily a taken man. He might be a hiding man. The distinction mattered enormously. Sergeant Tilly went to Linden House at 2 o'clock on Saturday afternoon with Gerald and, rather insistently, Miss Marple. The house stood behind a beech hedge that had grown, unchecked for a few years, into a proper wall of copper brown. The gate was latched, but not locked. The gravel path was moss-spotted, and the flower borders had taken on that philosophical quality of gardens left to manage themselves. Not wild, not dead, simply doing what seemed best without instruction. The garden room window at the back, a low extension, half greenhouse, half sunroom, had its latch clearly visible from the path, and it was clearly unfastened. Sergeant Tilly knocked at the front door, then the side door. Then he tried the back door, which was locked. He stood for a moment, clearly making a decision, and then looked at Miss Marple. She said nothing. She simply waited. He knocked on the garden room window. A pause. Then a longer pause. Then, very carefully, the inner door to the garden room opened. Edwin Hobbs looked out. He was pale and somewhat disheveled, and was wearing what appeared to be two jumpers layered one over the other, which suggested he had spent at least one cool night in an unheated house. He had a mug in his hand, cold tea by the look of it, and the expression of a man who has been expecting something like this and is not entirely sure whether he is relieved or resigned. He looked at Sergeant Tilly, then at Gerald, then at Miss Marple. His eyes rested on Miss Marple for a moment. "You'd better come in," he said. The garden room smelled of cold stone and stale air, and the particular staleness of a space that has been lived in slightly without being meant for it. There was a sleeping bag on the old garden bench, and a carrier bag with food, bread, apples, a tin of sardines, and, somewhat incongruously, a jar of the good mustard he had bought on Tuesday. He had been prepared, in a minimal, practical way, the kind of preparation that suggests not panic, but decision. "Mr. Hobbs," Sergeant Tilly said, "with careful gentleness, we've been rather concerned." Edwin looked at Miss Marple again. She had the distinct impression he was trying to work out how much she knew. "Most of it," she said pleasantly. "I'm afraid. Not all." Edwin sat down on the garden bench beside his sleeping bag and looked at his cold tea. "I wasn't going to be long," he said. "I just needed I needed to make sure he'd gone, and that whatever he'd come to do was done." "What had he come to do?" Sergeant Tilly asked. Edwin was quiet for a moment. The copper beech hedge made a soft sound in the wind, like distant traffic. "He came to tell me about Hugh," Edwin said. "About Hugh dying. He wasn't kind about it. He seemed to think I'd be glad. I wasn't glad. Hugh was a difficult man, but he kept his word in the end. He kept his word." He paused. "David wanted to know if I would say anything about the old business, even now. He seemed to think I still might." "And would you?" Gerald asked. Edwin looked at him with the steady patience of a man who has been sitting with a question for 30 years. "No," he said. "I wouldn't. Not because I'm frightened, but because it was 30 years ago, and everyone involved is old or dead, and what would be the point?" He paused. I just wanted him to believe that and go away. He had, Miss Marple thought, gone to ground in the way that sensible small animals do, not fleeing, but becoming very quiet and very still until the threat passed. "David Carow is gone," Sergeant Tilly said. "He left the village this morning. His car was seen on the Barton Road." Edwin received this information the way a man receives news he has been waiting for, without visible relief, because the relief was already there, beneath everything, and the news simply confirmed it. "Right," he said. "Right," said Sergeant Tilly. Miss Marple looked at the mustard jar and said nothing at all. Chapter 11. Things that want saying. They brought Edwin back to Wisteria End, because Dorothy had been anxious, and because it seemed the natural thing to do, and because Vera was on her way and the cottage would require a certain amount of reinstatement before it was properly habitable again. The back gate needing latching, and the milk situation needing addressing. He came quietly. carrying his sleeping bag and his carrier bag, and his cold tea with the self-contained dignity of a man who has made an unconventional choice and sees no reason to apologize for it. Dorothy made sandwiches. Gerald made tea, properly, in the good pot. Vivienne, who was in the sitting room when Edwin came through the door, stood up. They looked at each other for a long moment. Miss Marple, watching from the doorway, had the distinct impression of watching two people who had been conducting a very long and very private conversation without ever speaking a word, and who had now reached the part where words might finally be possible. She went to see about her own tea. Edwin sat at the kitchen table with Dorothy and Gerald and Miss Marple and ate his sandwiches with the appetite of a man who has had bread, apples, tinned sardines, and mustard for 2 days and finds ordinary sandwiches profound. He was not communicative, but he was present in a way that seemed slightly different from his usual self-containment. Lighter, perhaps. Less burdened. The seedlings, Miss Marple said after a while. In the greenhouse. Were you aware they needed watering? Edwin looked at her. They'll be fine till Monday, he said. I only watered them Sunday. I thought as much, she said. A small silence. The trowel and the hand fork, she said. In your shed. They were on the wrong hooks. Edwin frowned. Were they? Someone had replaced them incorrectly. She looked at him. Not you. He thought about this. David went to the shed, he said slowly. When I went inside to get my things, I came back and he was in the shed. Said he was looking for the key to the back gate. His expression shifted slightly. I didn't notice the hooks. You had other things to notice, Miss Marple said. I locked the shed, he said. After. Habit. You did, she agreed, but you went out through the back gate and left it unlatched. He looked mildly sheepish, which on Edwin Hobbs was quite a significant expression. I was in a hurry. You were, she said, and the secateurs on the bird bath very neatly set down. He was quiet for a moment. I was going to come back, he said. I thought I was going to come back by the afternoon. A pause. And then I thought, if David is still here, better to wait. And then it was evening, and then it seemed like staying put was the safest thing. It was, Miss Marple said. You were quite sensible. Gerald opened his mouth and then closed it. The expression on his face suggested he had approximately 40 things he wanted to say and was wisely saying none of them. Edwin drank his tea. Good tea, hot and strong, the first in 2 days. He held the cup in both hands the way people do when they have been cold and are now warm. Not for the warmth exactly, but for the reminder of it. I should have told someone, he said to the table. I know that. I should have telephoned Vera. I should have said something. He paused. But it felt like something I had to manage myself. I'd been managing it by myself for 30 years. One more day didn't seem very different. 30 years is rather a long time to manage something alone, Dorothy said gently. It is, Edwin agreed. He did not expand on this. Miss Marple thought of the library book with the receipt bookmark. He had been reading about kitchen gardens. He had been planting spring bulbs. He had, for 30 years, been a man who turned inward and let his garden speak for him, and had found this sufficient. And perhaps it had been. Whether it was still sufficient, whether 2 days in a cold house with a tin of sardines and good mustard had settled something, or whether it had only postponed it, was not for her to say. She drank her own tea and looked out the window at the garden, which was golden in the afternoon light, the roses losing their last petals one by one, each one falling exactly as it should. Vera arrived at 4:30, slightly breathless from driving fast, and sat down beside her brother and took his hand without saying anything, which seemed to be exactly what was needed. Miss Marple excused herself and went upstairs and sat by her window with her knitting for a little while, listening to the quiet sound of the village settling into its Saturday evening. Chapter 12. The Weight of Old Business. On Sunday morning, Sergeant Tilley came round with the slightly careful manner of a man who has certain official things to say and would very much like not to have to say them. He sat in the sitting room with Edwin and Gerald and Dorothy and Miss Marple and explained that a report would need to be filed, that Edwin's disappearance, however entirely voluntary and sensible it may have been, had resulted in police enquiries and a certain amount of official notation, and that there might be questions about David Caro and the matter he had come to discuss. Edwin listened to all of this with the patience of a man who has expected it. "I'll cooperate fully," he said. "Ask whatever you need to ask." What came out then, over the course of a Sunday morning, while Dorothy made more tea than anyone required and the church bells counted the hours from the Norman Tower across the field, was the history of a property development in Bristol in the spring of 1992. A parcel of land on the edge of the city, a development plan, money from investors, some of whom were not entirely aware of what they were investing in, a survey, and here was the part that had mattered, the part that had remained unspoken for 30 years, a survey that had been prepared by the landscape firm Edwin worked for, and that had, at the instruction of the man who commissioned it, omitted certain relevant facts about the lands, drainage, facts that would have materially affected the investment. Edwin had known. He had been the junior surveyor. He had been 28 and had been told, in terms he remembered precisely, that this was how things were done and he would do well to keep his head down. He had. He had kept his head down for 30 years. Hugh Caro had been the developer. David Caro, his brother, had been the money man. Edwin had been the most junior and the most peripheral, and the one who had, perhaps for that reason, felt the weight of it most. Were any investors harmed? Sergeant Tilly asked. Some, Edwin said. The development eventually went through. It just took 3 years longer and cost more than anyone expected, because the drainage problem wasn't dealt with until it couldn't be ignored. Most people got most of their money back, eventually. It wasn't a catastrophe, but it was wrong. He looked at his hands. It was wrong, and I knew it was wrong, and I said nothing. You were 28, Gerald said. Yes, Edwin said. And then I was 30, and 40, and 50, and it was still wrong. Miss Marple observed this quietly. She had heard confessions of this particular kind before, not dramatic confessions. Not the confessions of people who had done terrible things, but the confessions of people who had done something they knew to be wrong and had carried it for so long that the carrying had become the thing, rather, than the original act. The weight of the silence was often heavier than the weight of the thing itself. Edwin had come to Wychwood Parva 31 years ago and had put himself into a garden and had tended it and had been very good at it and had been trusted and respected and had earned both. He had not run away. He had simply found a life in which he could be, as thoroughly as possible, the person he meant to be. The document Hugh had kept was gone. There was no evidence, now, of anything. The investors were old, or dead, or had moved on. The land was long since developed and resold several times. Legally, practically, there was nothing to be done and nothing that required doing. Hugh's intention, Edwin said, was to tell me it was over. The solicitor's letter, that's what it says. He wanted me to know he wasn't passing the matter on. That it died with him. A kind thing, Miss Marple observed. Yes, Edwin said. There was something in his voice she could not quite name. Not gratitude, exactly. Something older and more complicated than gratitude. The feeling, perhaps, of having been seen, at last, by someone who chose to look away. David Caro, by contrast, had come for different reasons. Not to reassure, but to assess. To determine whether Edwin might speak now, with the protective silence of the Caro family's long-standing guilt no longer enforced. To gauge whether he was a threat. He had found Edwin at the cottage, apparently. Had spoken to him. Edwin had been non-committal, and David had been not threatening, exactly, but watchful. The kind of watchful that Edwin had found after a lifetime of dealing with growing things indistinguishable from a frost warning. And so he had gone to ground. Understandable, Sergeant Tilly said. Completely, Miss Marple agreed. He closed his notebook. The formal report will note that Mr. Hobbs's disappearance was voluntary and no crime was committed. He paused. I don't anticipate any further action regarding Mr. Caro's visit unless Mr. Hobbs wishes to make a formal statement about any specific intimidation. I don't, Edwin said. Right then, Sergeant Tilly said, with the evident relief of a man who has navigated a complicated Sunday morning successfully. He went away, and the church bell rang midday, and Edwin sat for a while longer at the kitchen table and said very little, and Miss Marple knitted quietly in the corner and found that the particular quality of the silence in the room, not empty, not uncomfortable, but settled, like ground after rain, was rather pleasant. Chapter 13. The roses hold their last petals. Monday brought a different quality of day, cooler, with a mist that the sun burned off by mid-morning, leaving the village clean and sharp and somehow slightly new-looking, as a place can look after a matter has been resolved. Edwin came back to Wisteria End with his tools at his usual time. Not 7:30, not quite yet, but 9, which represented for Edwin Hobbs a significant and probably temporary relaxation of standards. He nodded at Miss Marple, who was sitting with her tea in the garden, and went to the greenhouse first to check the seedlings, which were, as he had predicted, perfectly fine. She watched him move through the garden, purposeful, unhurried, the way he always moved, and thought that there was something very satisfying about watching a skilled person do the thing they were skilled at in the place where it belonged. She had been thinking, over the weekend, about the shape of the whole business. It was not, as mysteries sometimes are, a grand thing. There had been no violence, no great crime, only an old and buried matter that had surfaced, briefly, in the form of a well-dressed man asking questions on a Tuesday morning, and a principled and somewhat stubborn man who had decided the simplest solution was to be temporarily unavailable. And yet, it had been 30 years, and it had touched several lives, Edwin's in the most sustained way, but Vivienne's too, in a different manner. She had come to Wychwood Parva not quite knowing what she would find, and had found both more and less than she expected, which is usually how it goes. She set down her tea and went to find Vivienne, who was in the small guest sitting room writing a letter. "I'm going home on Wednesday," Vivienne said, without turning from her writing desk. "I've decided." "I know," Miss Marple said, settling into the chair by the window, "though I wondered whether you might stay a little longer." "I don't think longer is quite right," Vivienne said. "At this point in one's life, it seems important to be accurate about what things are and aren't." She paused. "Edwin and I had a conversation yesterday evening, a proper one, which we have not had since 1981. It was very useful." "Useful," Miss Marple repeated, with the gentle precision of someone noting a significant understatement. "Useful," Vivienne confirmed, and there was a small sound in her voice that might have been a smile. They sat together for a while, the morning light coming through the window, the sound of Edwin's rake carrying from the south border. "He's a good man," Vivienne said. "He made a mistake once, when he was young and frightened, and he's been paying interest on it ever since." She paused. "That's quite enough of that." "Quite," Miss Marple agreed. There was a comfortable silence. "You knew from very early on," Vivienne said. "It was not quite a question." "I had suspicions early," Miss Marple said honestly. "I knew, or thought I knew, from the seedlings. A man who plants for spring has not decided to go away permanently, and the tool shed confirmed something wrong had happened there, though not necessarily to Edwin. And the secateurs on the bird bath told me he had stepped away mid-task, which meant he had not been taken in the middle of the night, but in the middle of a working day. So he went himself. Which narrowed things considerably. If he had been taken, I would have been far more worried. A man who removes himself has made a decision. A decision can be reversed." Vivienne absorbed this. "And David Caro?" "I was worried about David Caro," Miss Marple admitted. "I was not entirely sure what his intention was. When I saw him at the public house, I did not know whether he had come to warn Edwin or to threaten him. The letter in his pocket suggested the former. It was, as we later confirmed, a copy of the solicitor's notification. But I could not be certain. He came to make sure Edwin wouldn't talk," Vivienne said flatly. Yes, and in so doing, rather ensured that Edwin had less reason to trust him than if he had simply stayed away. She paused. People who come to check whether you might betray them have usually given you more reason to consider it than those who don't. Vivian laughed, a short, dry sound. Edwin hasn't talked in 30 years. He wasn't about to start. No, Miss Marple said. But David Caro didn't know that. He only knew what Edwin might have done. He didn't know Edwin. She looked out the window at the garden, where Edwin was now at the rose border with his secateurs, the proper ones, back from the birdbath, trimming the last spent blooms with the focused care of someone performing an act of devotion. Edwin knows himself rather well, she said. He does, Vivian agreed, for which I suppose we should be grateful. It saved us all a good deal of trouble. It saved him rather more, Miss Marple said, though he would never put it quite that way. Chapter 14. What the village makes of it all. In the way of small villages, the resolution of Edwin Hobbs's disappearance became, within 48 hours, a story that the village understood to its satisfaction, which is to say, a story that was coherent, that reflected well on the people they already liked, that made reasonable sense of the things that had puzzled them, and that contained just enough that was unrevealed to remain pleasantly interesting for several seasons. The version that circulated was this. Edwin had received an unexpected visit from someone connected to his past. The visit had been unwelcome, and Edwin, being Edwin, had dealt with it in his own way, quietly and without fuss, and was now back in the garden where he belonged. The specifics were vague and remained vague. No one pressed. This was partly tact and partly the English village's deep-seated understanding that some things are one's own business, no matter how interesting they might be as other people's. Audrey Pickles, in the post office, told Miss Marple she had always thought there was something about Edwin. Not something wrong, something composed. Something that spoke of a person who had had to make themselves entirely self-sufficient in the way that only happens when there has been, at some point, a very particular kind of struggle. She said all this with the genuine insight of someone who has spent years watching people across a counter and has learned, through that watching, how to see. You're very perceptive, Miss Marple said. I'm in a good position, Audrey said, with the comfortable accuracy of someone who knows exactly what their position is worth. Mrs. Margaret Voss, who had lost sleep over Edwin, made him a casserole which he received with such genuine bewilderment that Dorothy, who had witnessed the exchange, reported it to Miss Marple with the affection of someone describing a very particular and entirely characteristic moment. He had held the casserole dish and looked at it, and then looked at Mrs. Voss and said, simply, "That's very good of you, Mrs. Voss." He managed it perfectly, Dorothy said. He generally does, Miss Marple replied. The man she kept thinking about, in the days after the resolution, was David Caro, driving back toward Cardiff on the Barton Road Saturday morning, with the solicitor's letter in his pocket and whatever calculation he was making in his mind. She had no particular sympathy for him, but she had a kind of interested observation to offer. He had come expecting to find something he could use, and he had found, instead, a man who had been gardening in Wychwood Parva for 31 years and was firmly, quietly, entirely resolved not to be useful to anyone's purposes. The disappointed villain, if one wished to use such a word, which Miss Marple did only in the loosest sense, since David Caro seemed to her more frightened than villainous, is always slightly to be pitied. Not much, but slightly. She walked on Tuesday afternoon, her penultimate day, along the footpath to Barton Magna and back, which was a 4-mile round trip and more than she usually attempted, but the light was extraordinary, and the path was good, and she felt, in the uncomplicated way that good autumn weather can produce. Like walking the Cotswolds in September, under a sky of that particular luminous gray-white that means fine weather consolidating, is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It simply is. The dry stone walls, the long fields going amber, the woods on the hills beginning their color in the most considered and leisurely way possible, as if beauty were a process rather than an event. She thought about what the village had given her and what she had given back. Not much in the grand ledger. She had noticed things. She had asked questions. She had done a small amount of thinking that would probably have been done by someone else in due course. The detective inspector from Cheltenham had told her on a brief call on Sunday that David Carrow was known to him as a peripheral and not particularly significant figure in several Bristol area property matters, and that his visit to Wychwood Parva had been noted and would be remembered, not prosecuted, not pursued, simply noted and remembered, which is sometimes what justice looks like when it is working at its quietest and most patient. She stopped on the footpath at the stile that marked the boundary between two farms and looked back at the village, the church tower, the cluster of stone rooftops, the dark line of the beech hedge around Linden House, and somewhere behind it all, invisible but present, the garden at Wisteria, end with its roses and its dahlias and its spring bulbs waiting underground. A place, she thought, simply a place, made by the people in it, and making them in return. She climbed the stile with some difficulty and with a cheerful refusal to acknowledge the difficulty, and walked on. Chapter 15. Before the Bus and After the Roses. Miss Marple left Wychwood Parva on a Wednesday afternoon, which felt right. She had arrived on a Tuesday and departed on a Wednesday, and there was something satisfying in the symmetry. Though she was too sensible to find meaning in mere pattern, she found no harm in noticing it. Dorothy made sandwiches for the journey, which Miss Marple accepted with genuine gratitude and placed carefully in the bag that also contained her knitting, her blue wool scarf with the fringe she had still not repaired, and the library book she had meant to read but had not got round to, on account of there having been rather more to get round to. The morning was given over to the comfortable work of departure, the folding and packing, the checking of cupboards, the thank yous and the assurances of return, the particular warmth that gathers in a house when someone is about to leave it, which is one of the more unexpected consequences of saying goodbye. Gerald shook her hand with both of his and said that it had been entirely illuminating, in a tone that encompassed both a great deal of meaning and perfect social propriety. Vivienne, who had left on Monday as planned, had said her own goodbyes with the quiet efficiency of a woman who has learned not to make departures more complicated than they need to be. But she had found a moment on Sunday evening to sit with Miss Marple one final time by the sitting-room fire and had said simply, "Thank you." "I haven't done anything very remarkable," Miss Marple said. "You saw things clearly," Vivienne said. "That's quite a lot in my experience." It was Edwin she wanted to speak with before she left, and she found him in the garden at 9:30 on her last morning, as she had expected she would, working along the south border with the care and quiet contentment of a man who is exactly where he belongs. He had, in the 4 days since his return, put things right with a thoroughness that went beyond the practical. The garden looked, if anything, better, as though the brief period of official abandonment had been followed by a slightly elevated attention. The way convalescence sometimes produces a sharper appreciation of ordinary things. The last roses were being dead-headed with the particular tenderness of someone saying a proper goodbye, which seemed fitting. "Mr. Hobbs," she said. He straightened up and looked at her. He was a tall man, Edwin Hobbs, though she had not quite registered this until now, stooped slightly from a lifetime of tending low things, with hands that were permanently earth-stained in the manner of hands that have done their proper work. He had the face, she thought, of a man who had spent a great deal of time looking at the same piece of ground and learning it more thoroughly each year. "You're leaving today," he said. "This afternoon. The 4 o'clock bus." He nodded. He put the dead rose heads in his bucket with the deliberate movement of someone who is going to say something and is preparing himself. "I understand," he said at last, "that you put some things together. That you were helpful." "I noticed some things," she said. "That's all. The important things were already there to be seen." "The seedlings," he said, and she saw a slight expression cross his face, surprised, possibly, that she had understood what the seedlings meant. "The seedlings," she agreed. "A man who is planting for spring has something to plant for. a brief silence. The wood pigeon had begun again. Somewhere in the copper beech over the wall, the same patient repetitive statement, entirely convinced of its own importance. "I didn't handle it well," Edwin said. "You handled it in the way that seemed best to you," Miss Marple replied. "And it came right, in the end." "Things," Vivienne said. He stopped, began again. "Some things are going to be different. Going forward. I'm not sure yet how." He paused. "But different." He said it in the way that men of his generation say significant things, simply, without elaboration, trusting the listener to understand the full weight of what has been set down with such economy. "I think that's wise," Miss Marple said. They stood for a moment in the garden, under the September sky, with the last roses around them, and the autumn just beginning to make itself properly known in the color of the light. "The trowel and the hand fork," she said. "I put them back correctly." He looked at her with an expression she could not quite name. Gratitude, she thought, but mixed with something that might have been humor and might have been recognition. "I know," he said. "I noticed." She walked back to the cottage and finished her packing and ate Dorothy's sandwiches on the bus, which was warm and slightly overfull and smelled, pleasantly, of several different people shopping. The Cotswold hills moved past the window in the 4 o'clock light, amber and umber, stone and green, and Miss Marple watched them with the uncomplicated pleasure of someone who has been somewhere and done what needed doing and is now going home. The blue wool scarf with the fringe was in her bag, still unrepaired. She would attend to it this week. She really would. The bus driver changed gears on the hill outside Barton Magna with the same cheerful certainty he always did, and the village of Wychwood Parva passed below and behind and was presently lost among the hills, as small English villages always are, invisible and permanent and entirely itself. Miss Marple's needles clicked once, then twice, and then kept going in their steady, comfortable rhythm all the way to St. Mary Mead.